The Wild West. It is the fundamental mythology of the United States of America. The iconography and imagery we've chosen to tell the story of who we are as a people and as a country. It's a mythology that's so enduring that depictions of it stretch from the yellowed pages of dime novels written while the West was still being won to the controllers and keyboards of gamers playing Red Dead Redemption 2 today. On film, from Edwin S. Porter's The Great Train Robbery in 1903, all the way up to James Samuel's The Harder They Fall in 2021, and a couple of movies since then that are Westerns, the splendor and danger of the American West has captivated the imaginations of generations. The iconic figures of the American West are just as familiar. They're the stalwart lawmen like Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp, the outlaws they faced like Jesse James and Billy the Kid. There are gamblers like Doc Holliday, who lived for a little while in Leadville too. In fact, I think gambled at the Silver Dollar for at least a couple times. He actually ran a gambling table. He wasn't just a gambler. The way those guys would make their living is that they would run a faro table. And he did that over here until he shot a guy. Didn't work out so well. Scouts like Buffalo Bill Cody, warriors like Crazy Horse, Tashunke Whitko, Geronimo, Guy Halka. And these names, these men have become more than historical figures. As fiction trumped fact and the legends that they lived were superimposed over their actual lives. Each of these was a real man, but in the telling and retelling of their tales, they've taken on the status of folk heroes, as much Paul Bunyan or Pecos Bill as William Frederick Cody or James Butler Hickok. Yet when we take a step back from the individuals and individual stories woven into the tapestry of the American West, a curious theme emerges. Picture a meeting of these great Western men. Standing there are the scout Buffalo Bill, the lawman Wild Bill, the gambler Doc Holliday, the outlaw Jesse James. So when you picture them, how are they dressed? Is Wild Bill wearing a marshal's hat? Does Jesse James have on outlaw boots? Of course not. The wide-brimmed Stetson shading their eyes from the sun is a cowboy hat, and on their feet are tall leather cowboy boots. If the great men of the American West weren't cowboys, how did the cowboy become the single most iconic figure of the American West? The truth is that there was a famous cowboy who stood beside these men in real life, and whose legacy is just as enduring, although his name has been all but forgotten by the casual student of American history. In 1873, when Buffalo Bill convinced Wild Bill to join a traveling stage show called the Scouts of the Plains, their co-star was a real-life cowboy named John Baker Omohundro. Friends called him Texas Jack. Born on July 27, 1846, in Fluvanna County, Virginia, Jack served as a Confederate courier and scout during the Civil War, for a time under vaunted cavalryman Major General Jeb Stuart, before drifting west to Texas in the life of an open-range cowboy. On stage, Cody and Hickok impressed crowds with tales of buffalo hunting on horseback and gunslinging in frontier towns, while in his baritone Virginia drawl, Texas Jack thrilled with stories of wild stampedes and cattle rustlers. Texas Jack actually was from Virginia. He wasn't from Texas. He got the name because no one could pronounce Omohundro, and one time he was a cowboy in Texas and took a group of cattle with a group to Tennessee. This was after the Civil War. There had been a bad drought, and Tennessee was having a real problem getting meat. And so when they got there, they pulled in, led a herd of cattle into a town, and the people came out because they were so excited to get fresh meat. And the mayor of the town asked one of the cowboys, "Where are you from and who's in charge?" And he said, "We're from Texas and Jack's in charge." And so the mayor turned to the other townspeople and said, "Well, let's cheer for Texas Jack." And the name stuck. Jack entertained packed halls, auditoriums, and theaters as he whirled his lasso overhead, the first to turn that tool of the cowboy trade into an object of entertainment for fascinated audiences. Texas Jack was the first cowboy to rise to prominence in American popular imagination, and his stage persona provided the foundation on which the cowboy trope in literature and film would be built. To understand the impact of Texas Jack and just how unlikely it was that the open-range cowboy should achieve such status and permanence in American pop culture, we should reflect on the history of the cowboy, both the word and the profession. For most of American history, it was actually an insult to call a man cowboy. During the American Revolution, the term cowboy referred to British loyalists who stole livestock from local farmers and delivered it to British troops. On January 22, 1779, New Yorkers hanged Claudius Smith, who they called the Cowboy of the Ramapos, for his guerrilla raids after the governor of New York, George Clinton, posted a $1,200 reward for his capture. The word cowboy remained unflattering as late as the early 1880s, when the San Francisco's Daily Exchange called cowboys, quote, the most reckless class of outlaws in the wild country, infinitely worse than the ordinary robber. The editors in this case were referring to the infamous cowboys of Cochise County, an especially ruthless band of rustlers and outlaws that operated near Tombstone, Arizona, or Arizona Territory at the time. And their criminal activities were only curtailed by the October 26, 1881 gunfight at the OK Corral, or at least near the OK Corral. If you go to the OK Corral, you're not standing where the gunfight happened. They like you to think it is, but it was in an empty lot nearby. And then, of course, the Earp Vendetta ride that came after that. The passage of time and other factors have shaped our present-day view of the cowboy. The mid-1880s saw the expansion of the cattle industry from Texas across the entire West. American businessmen and wealthy European investors built vast ranches, bought cattle, and hired cowboys, leading to one of the biggest economic booms in history. Their investments provided a foundation for U.S. dominance of the world economy while simultaneously funding the development of cities and infrastructure across the West. Books like Owen Wister's 1902 novel The Virginian began to mythologize the cowboy, and literary giants from Zane Grey to Louis L'Amour followed suit. Hollywood gravitated to the cowboy in Western locations from its earliest films well into the late 20th century. Westerns dominated movie house screens following World War II, and cowboy stories dominated Westerns. Leading actors across multiple generations starred in Westerns, from William S. Hart and Tom Mix to John Wayne and James Stewart, Burt Lancaster and Clint Eastwood, to today Idris Elba or Benedict Cumberbatch. That's just so I can pronounce Benedict Cumberbatch. After the devastating loss of both his mother and wife to illness on Valentine's Day of 1884, and if you ever thought you had a bad Valentine's Day, Theodore Roosevelt's Valentine's Day in 1884 ended with both his wife and his mother dying in the same house on the same day. After that devastating loss, he escaped west to start a cattle ranch north of Medora in what would soon become North Dakota. He was indelibly shaped by Western ranch life and the cowboys he befriended there. Returning to Medora by train in 1900 on a campaign swing for incumbent President William McKinley, the vice presidential candidate Roosevelt told locals, quote, "I'd studied a lot about men and things before I saw you fellows, but it was only when I came here that I began to know anything or to measure men right." It was Roosevelt's time out west that would shape and refine the New York City boy into the cowboy president. And he wouldn't be the last politician to exploit the cowboy image of rugged independence to improve his standing with American voters. Film stars, authors, and politicians aside, no one has had more influence on the popular perception of the cowboy than one man, Buffalo Bill Cody. From its May 1883 inception as Cody and Carver's Rocky Mountain and Prairie exhibition, the short-lived partnership with sharpshooter William Frank Doc Carver, until Cody's 1917 death, no entertainment was as prevalent or successful as Buffalo Bill's Wild West. The imagery and iconography of Buffalo Bill are indelibly tied to the profession of the cowboy, the rare occupation that Cody, a messenger, scout, soldier, teamster, buffalo hunter, showman, town planner, and sometimes hotel proprietor, never actually held. Cody plowed his theatrical profits into ranching, author Louis Warren explains in Buffalo Bill's America, but like most ranch owners, he was an absentee owner who was never a cowboy. But central to Cody's vision of the Wild West, and indeed the defining icon of the Western man, was the cowboy. For more than 2 decades, the culminating act of the Wild West show was listed in the program as an attack on a settler's cabin by hostile Indians repulsed by cowboys under the leadership of Buffalo Bill. With civilization at stake and the fate of the emblematic family of white settlers hiding in the cabin on the line, the group of heroes riding to the rescue was not comprised of professional soldiers, but cowboys, of course led by Buffalo Bill. When Cody, who scouted for the military well before taking to the stage, rode into actual engagements with hostile Sioux and Cheyenne on the Great Plains and Dakota Territory hills, he did so in the company of trained soldiers, not ever really with cowboys. So why then did Cody present the cowboy as the savior of the settler and of civilization itself from the threat of savagery? The answer is the man that Buffalo Bill would eulogize here at the grave in 1908 as, quote, one of my dearest and most intimate friends, Texas Jack Omohundro. Texas Jack rode into Buffalo Bill's life as a cowboy in 1869. Buffalo Bill had just been placed in charge of the government livestock at Fort McPherson, Nebraska, near North Platte, and kept on the payroll between scouting assignments. It was just then that Omohundro rode into nearby North Platte, trailing a few thousand head of longhorn. The men were soon inseparable. They hunted together, they drank together, they scouted together, they even hung wallpaper in Bill Cody's North Platte home together. If you've ever hung wallpaper with anybody, that is a real friend. When Buffalo Bill spent long weeks away scouting for the 3rd U.S. Cavalry, Texas Jack stayed in a spare room at the Cody house to ensure the safety of Bill's wife Louisa and their children. Pards of the plains for life is how Cody defined the relationship. On April 25th, 1872, just over 151 years ago now, Buffalo Bill and Texas Jack set out from Fort McPherson in pursuit of Minneconjou Sioux raiders who the night before had stolen 7 horses from nearby McPherson Station on the Union Pacific Railroad. Guiding 46 troopers and an Army surgeon across under the command of 3rd Cavalry Captain Charles Meinhold, they tracked the thieves. The next afternoon, after a brief skirmish on the Loop Fork of the Platte River, in which Buffalo Bill was injured and 3 warriors were killed, the party recovered 2 horses while the surviving raiders escaped. In his after-action report, Meinhold singles out 4 men for mention. The first were Sergeant John H. Foley, who, quote, charged into the Indian camp without knowing how many Indians he might encounter, and First Sergeant Leroy H. Vokes, quote, who bravely closed in upon an Indian while he was fired at several times and wounded him. The next was Bill Cody, whose, quote, reputation for bravery and skill as a guide is so well established, I need not say anything else that he acted in his usual manner. The last was Texas Jack Omohundro, quote, a very good trailer and a brave man who knows the country well. I respectfully recommend his employment as a guide should the service of one in addition to Mr. Cody be needed. Of those 4, Bill Cody, Foley, and Vokes each received a Medal of Honor for gallantry in action. The reason Texas Jack didn't is because he wasn't legally actually able to even be there. He was had been a former Confederate scout and spy. It was against regulations for him to be hired, but Bill Cody kind of convinced everybody to look the other way while he paid Texas Jack under the table until such time as he could write a letter to the Secretary of War himself, who authorized Texas Jack's ability to actually serve as a scout afterwards. Clippings from local papers expand on the day's events. A reporter for the North Platte Democrat wrote that after Cody began firing at the Minneconjou Raiders, quote, the remainder of the command, hearing the fire, came up at full jump, Texas Jack at the head. He immediately let drive and brought his Indian down. Besides enjoying a reputation of a dead shot, he's well skilled in the ways of the red man, and we're glad to know that his services have been retained by the government. I always should say before this, that's a direct quote, not my sentiments at all. Obviously, the casual racism of all sorts was prevalent at the time, but it speaks to kind of the overarching themes of men like Texas Jack and Buffalo Bill's lives. Buffalo Bill also described the fight in his first autobiography. 2 mounted warriors closed in on me and were shooting at short range, he said. I returned their fire and had the satisfaction of seeing one fall from his horse. At this moment, I felt blood trickling down my forehead, and hastily running my hand through my hair, I discovered I'd received a scalp wound. Another paper picked up the action with a rhetorical flourish. To Texas Jack was Buffalo Bill indebted for his life. The red thieves were pursued and overtaken by Bill and Jack, who each killed an Indian. A third had just drawn a bead on Bill when Texas Jack's quick eye caught the gleam of the shining barrel, and the next instant the noble man was on his way to the happy hunting grounds, his passage from this sublunary sphere expedited by a bullet from Texas Jack's rifle at a distance of 125 yards. If the later account is to be believed, Texas Jack quite literally saved Buffalo Bill's life that April afternoon. What is certain is that Omohundro was Buffalo Bill's best friend, the first man that Cody telegrammed when his 5-year-old son, Kit Carson, died on April 20th, 1876. He sent, they actually were at a show in Massachusetts, and Buffalo Bill's wife sent him an urgent telegram and said, I don't think our son is going to make it through the night. So in the intermission of the show, Buffalo Bill hopped on a train. There wasn't an earlier train. That was the first one. So he actually played the first half of the show, left to get on a train, and went home and spent about an hour with his son before he passed away of scarlet fever. And the next day, Texas Jack received a telegram from him that said, "My only darling boy has died." And he sent his sister a telegram that basically confirmed that was the worst moment of his life up until that point. Sadly, he would have a lot more tragedy. For 3 years on the Nebraska prairie, Buffalo Bill and Texas Jack rode, hunted, scouted, and camped together. For 4 years on theatrical stages from Maine to Texas, they appeared in more than 550 performances, not counting matinees. On stage, Texas Jack was the picture of the cowboy. His costume included the ever-present Stetson, tall black cavalry boots, and a fringed buckskin jacket, worn open to reveal the Lone Star of Texas emblazoned on his shirt. He carried a lasso, rifle, revolver, and Bowie knife, prepared for any danger that might come his way. More often than not, that danger on the stage took the form of hostile Indian warriors. These captivated stage encounters, Texas Jack locked in deadly combat against a tomahawk-wielding brave, were the genesis of the cowboys and Indians' backyard games for generations to come. The concept of cowboys fighting Indians on the outskirts of civilization is so firmly ingrained in the collective consciousness that it seems cliched, but the reality of the cowboy stands in stark contrast with such romantic depictions in print and on screen. By the time of the big Texas cattle drives of the late 1860s, herders meticulously avoided conflict with Indians. After all, ranch owners entrusted their cowboys with the care of their valuable stock, and ensuring the safe conduct of those charges during transportation made cowboys more akin to present-day truck drivers than buckskin-clad knights. The era of cattle drives along the Chisholm Trail, Goodnight Loving Trail, and countless others lasted only from 1866 until the 1890s, when the expansion of rail lines and the laying of hundreds of miles of barbed wire fence rendered the job of open-range cowboy obsolete. During those scant 30 years of cowboy primacy, swift streams swollen by rain, lightning strikes, falls from horseback, and disease all accounted for the majority of cowboy deaths. A cowboy was far more likely to draw his gun on a farmer than a card sharp across a town square at high noon. He was much more likely to fire his rifle at a coyote than at a Comanche raider. Dust and tedium were the rule of a cowboy's work, as was enduring the worst of conditions to ensure top dollar for beef. Unlike the fiction, real cowboys' lives were far from romantic. By all rights, Lon Taylor wrote in The American Cowboy, he should have joined the hunters of Kentucky, the whalers, the flatboatmen, the plainsmen, and all the other American types who briefly caught the popular imagination, were popularized on the stage and in song, and were then forgotten. But the open-range cowboy was never forgotten. The reason the cowboy endured while all those other professions were forgotten is that after the death of his cowboy friend Texas Jack, Buffalo Bill Cody refused to let the public forget. Once a lone cowboy rode with Buffalo Bill across the prairies of Nebraska. Now hundreds of cowboys followed his lead in the spectacle of the Wild West. Where once a single cowboy stood on stage and twirled his lasso, now a legion of men demonstrated cowboy skills for audiences worldwide. Buffalo Bill enshrined Texas Jack's experience as a cowboy in show programs handed out to millions of men, women, and children visiting the Wild West at stops in cities across the United States and throughout Europe. From the inaugural performance in 1883 and in long stands at New York's Madison Square Garden in 1886 and 87, Queen Victoria's 1887 Golden Jubilee in London, the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, Paris, Vienna, every major city in Europe, the Wild West programs contained a section simply titled The Cowboy, written by Texas Jack in the spring of 1877. The Cowboy began the piece that introduced the profession to so many eager spectators. How often spoken of, how falsely imagined, how greatly despised where not known, how little understood. I've been there considerably. With depictions of stampedes and storms, cowboys singing to restless steers at night, and cow scents, Omohundro outlines a profession requiring the patience of Job and peopled by ambitious, adventurous, and rebellious young men, quote, taught at school to admire the deceased little Georgie Washington and his exploring adventures, if not equaling him in cherry tree goodness. Signing with a flourish as both J.B. Omohundro and Texas Jack, the author concludes on a wistful note. How many, though, never finish, but mark the trail with their silent graves, no one can tell. But when Gabriel toots his horn, the Chisholm Trail will swarm with cowboys. Howsomever, we'll all be there, let's hope, for a happy trip when we say to this planet, adios. And searching for an archetype of the kind of man Buffalo Bill, again a soldier, a scout, and a buffalo hunter, but not a cowboy, would elevate above all other professions in his simulacrum of the real West, presented as absolute historical truth to huge audiences on both sides of the Atlantic, one need look no further than John Baker, Texas Jack Omohundro, cowboy. Perhaps the breadth of cowboy adventures in literature and on film can also be attributed to the well-publicized exploits of Texas Jack. Years before Lakota warriors traveled with the Wild West, Texas Jack led the Pawnees on their 1872 penultimate summer buffalo hunt in Nebraska. Before Cody defiantly erected his tents opposite the exclusive 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, Texas Jack set up a Western-themed hotel, saloon, and shooting gallery opposite the 1876 Centennial International Exposition in Philadelphia. Before Cody and Doc Carver launched the Wild West Extravaganza in 1883, Omohundro and Carver displayed their skills with rifle, pistol, and bow and arrow at a series of exhibitions in 1878. If the life of the average cowboy was trail dust and tedium, Texas Jack was never short on excitement, adventure, and romance. In 1873, he married his beautiful co-star, the peerless Giuseppina Morlacchi, an Italian-born prima ballerina who was among the most famous dancers of the era, having introduced the can-can to the American stage in 1868. In 1874, Texas Jack guided Anglo-Irish noble and adventurer, the Earl of Dunraven, through the newly established Yellowstone National Park. 3 years later, he blazed a new trail into the park from the southeast and rescued tourists from marauding Nez Perce as the latter fled army troops through the park. Jack led Western hunts for such aristocrats as Dunraven, Sir John Ray Reed, and Count Otto Frank, all significant figures in the coming boom of the American cattle industry. He scouted for Brigadier General Alfred Terry in pursuit of Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. Tatanka Ayotaki is his actual name. In the aftermath of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's June 25, 1876, defeat at the Little Big Horn or Greasy Grass. One night in 1878, Texas Jack surprised Thomas Edison in a Wyoming hotel, shooting a weather vane atop a freight depot from the window of Edison's hotel room to prove he was, quote, the boss pistol shot of the West. It's little wonder it took scores of cowboys to replace this one man in Buffalo Bill's Wild West. William Cody seldom spoke of death or of the people who died, his biographer Louis Warren notes. In all his correspondence, there's barely a mention of any deceased friends or acquaintances. He wrote no poignant words about Wild Bill Hickok, about Sitting Bull, or the Wild West manager and his partner Nate Salisbury. No matter how tragic their deaths, he seldom spoke of the loss. But Buffalo Bill did write multiple dime novels about his late cowboy friend Texas Jack. Omohundro, stricken with pneumonia, died in the high Rocky Mountain air in the town of Leadville, Colorado, on June 28, 1880, a month shy of his 34th birthday. On September 5, 1908, almost 3 decades after Texas Jack's death, Buffalo Bill Cody gathered the cast and crew of the Wild West around Omohundro's grave in Leadville's Evergreen Cemetery. There he delivered an impassioned eulogy for the man he called one of my dearest and most intimate friends, one of the original Texas cowboys, when life on the plains was a hardship and a trying duty. Buffalo Bill purchased the permanent gravestone that marks Texas Jack's final resting place today. Nearly a decade later, on January 6, 1917, an ailing Cody rode through Leadville for a final time on a return visit from Glenwood Springs to Denver. Too weak to leave his train car, he sat up in bed when he was told he was in Leadville to tell his daughter about the grave of Texas Jack, his best friend and his partner. 4 days later, Buffalo Bill was dead. Few men are truly remembered in the way the world remembers Buffalo Bill. Yet Americans largely forgot about Texas Jack Omohundro, the cowboy who first popularized the profession, the cowboy who introduced the lasso to the stage, and whose descriptions and depictions of his life on the open range spoke to millions of spectators from programs handed out at each stop of Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Americans recall the names of the legendary lawmen and outlaws, of the braves and the bandits, the soldiers and the scouts, but we forgot the name of our most important open range cowboy. Americans forgot, but Buffalo Bill remembered. And because Buffalo Bill remembered Texas Jack, the world remembers the cowboy. Thank you. And then, real quick, since it happened here, I want to read what Buffalo Bill had to say about Texas Jack while he was here. With the sun setting behind 14,000-foot Mount Massive, Buffalo Bill Cody and his Wild West troop gathered under the tall pines of Evergreen Cemetery in Leadville to pay tribute to Texas Jack. A reporter for the local Herald Democrat wrote that, quote, "If the spirit of Texas Jack were able to hover over the little mound that contains his mortal remains, he would have been gratified by the ceremonies in honor of his memory. They were the kind of ceremonies that his plain, rough, honest character would have asked for, could he have chosen. Brief, simple, and unaffected, but oh, how impressive." A reverend offered a prayer, and Buffalo Bill stepped forward to say a few words about his friend. Picture the scene. The silver-haired showman stands next to the pine slab, marking his old partner's final resting place. Around him are hundreds of Leadville locals, and next to him stands the reverend who conducted the service and the professor who led the brass band at Omohundro's funeral procession 28 years earlier. Members of Cody's Wild West show stand arrayed in their costumes. A dozen cavalrymen form a rough semicircle. Some of these men, like their leader Buffalo Bill, served the Union during the Civil War, fighting on the opposite side of the battlefield from the former Confederate soldier they now commemorated. Representatives of the Ute and Sioux tribes, also part of Cody's entourage, stand tall in war paint and feather headdresses as they listen to words spoken about a man who claimed Powhatan lineage, hunted with the Pawnee, Chatix, C. Chatix is the Pawnee's tribal name, fought against Comanche, Sioux, Nez Perce, and Cheyenne, Russian Cossack hunters, Japanese warriors, British cavalry, Arab riders, and German horsemen, all in their show garb, have come to pay their respects. A report in the local newspaper captures best the largest constituent group of men gathered for the ceremony. Quote, "Impressed by the ceremony, second only to Colonel Cody himself, was the crowd of cowboys, whose experience on the plains had been similar to those of the dead friend of their present-day chieftain. These men felt that the old scout was one of them. To them, the service was of greater import than to those whose life had been spent in some other pursuit. Tears welled in the eyes of many of these strong-muscled, large-hearted men. This was one of their comrades who they were honoring, a man who they knew and whose life was their life, though they had never met him. Here then were the cowboys of the Wild West, come to honor one of their own, the first of their kind. These men shared with Texas Jack the common bond of the trail, hours spent breathing the dust of the herd, nights filled with stories shared by campfire, and invented verse sung to restless dogies, tedious days and weeks broken only by the adrenaline rush of high river crossing, murderous rustler, and deadly stampede. Here stood the second generation of cowboy stars, held dear in American hearts as the rescuers of embattled settlers and the embodiment of the frontier man, acknowledging the first of their kind. Buffalo Bill removes his ever-present wide-brimmed Stetson, his famous locks now silvered and significantly thinned with age. He clutches the hat before him and begins to speak. My friends, perhaps many of you do not know the man who we have gathered to honor. No doubt you would like to know something of him, who is one of my dearest and most intimate friends. John B. Omohundro, better known as Texas Jack, was a Virginian by birth. The blood of the Powhatan Indians flowed in his veins. He was of proud and noble birth. During the Civil War, he was a member of the cavalry command under Colonel Jeb Stuart of the Confederate Army. He was one of his most trusted and faithful scouts, and performed almost invaluable service to him. After the war, he drifted westward and located in Texas, where he took up the hazardous work of the cowboy. He was one of the original Texas cowboys when life on the plains was a hardship and a trying duty. When they began to drive the cattle to the northern country, he engaged in that occupation, following the herds northward and returning after each trip for another herd. Finally, he located at North Platte, Nebraska. It was there that I first met him. He was an expert trailer and scout. I soon recognized this, and I tried to secure his appointment in United States service. But the authorities were unwilling to hire discharged Confederate scouts, so I had to take the matter to the Secretary of War. After much persuasion, I was given permission to hire him. In this capacity, I learned to know him and to respect his bravery and his ability. He was a whole-souled, brave, generous, and good-hearted man. Later, he and I went east to go into the show business. He was the first to do the lasso act on the stage. After a short career with the show, we again went west. That was in 1876 when the Sioux War was being fought. About the same time, General Custer was killed and we had to take part in many important engagements. After the Indian Wars, we returned east and again went on stage. During tours of large cities, he met and married Mademoiselle Morlocki, the famous dancer, who later traveled with him. After I left him, he and she continued to travel. They eventually came to Leadville, where she was engaged as a performer. Becoming attached to the place, my friend and his wife remained for a while. It was while here he was stricken with pneumonia, which was then prevalent. He succumbed and was buried here under this mound by his many friends. Among those who contributed to the ceremony at that time, and this is actually, I'm not related to this person, it was just a happy coincidence, was Mr. Kearns, who's here now, who remembers the manly traits of poor Jack. Here Buffalo Bill paused to gather himself before continuing. Texas Jack was an old friend of mine and a good one. Instead of the board which now marks his grave, we'll soon have erected a more substantial monument, one more worthy of a brave and a good man. Buffalo Bill's eyes followed the sweep of his hand past the board, beyond the pine trees and towards Mount Massive, towering in the fading orange sunset. A slight breeze played through the tops of the trees as they cast their long shadows over the assembled party. Buffalo Bill took a moment to wipe his brimming eyes with his handkerchief. He looked out over the assembled citizens of Leadville and to the cast of his Wild West show, the dozens of Native Americans, of soldiers, scouts, and cowboys that were employees, cast members, and friends. He placed a hand on the grave marker he meant to replace and returned the Stetson once again to his head. May he rest in peace. As the band played Nearer, My God, to Thee, Buffalo Bill placed a wreath of flowers on the grave of his old friend, mumbled a few brief words, mounted his horse, and rode away. Anybody have any questions about anything? Texas Jack? Or?
I have a question for you.
Awesome.
What inspired you to get into Texas Jack and deep diving so far to write a whole book about him?
Well, okay, so when I was young, my family used to travel out west a lot. My parents were both into hiking, backpacking. So in the springs, we would travel to New Mexico, Arizona, somewhere where it was warmer, and in the summers, we'd hit Colorado, Montana, and a lot of time in Wyoming. And another thing my parents liked, in addition to backpacking and hiking, was visiting small regional history museums, which a lot of times, if you've ever been to them, are like every farming implement that anybody in town decided they didn't need anymore was thrown into a barn. But every once in a while, you know, they're like, oh, here's a gun that belonged to Jesse James or something. And so I saw the name Texas Jack, you know, in passing. And then at some point, I realized that if you were a fan of Westerns, as they were in the 1870s, you could have, let's say you lived in New York City. In 1873, you could have gone down to Broadway and gone to a show and seen Wild Bill Hickok, Buffalo Bill Cody, and Texas Jack Omohundro acting as themselves on stage. And so what I thought was, what would be really fun is to have a novel where it was like a novel in 3 acts, and each act be about one of those guys. And I thought, oh, I'll try to do that. And so I thought, well, let me research those guys. Well, I found a good biography of Buffalo Bill. I found a really good biography of Wild Bill. And the only book ever written on Texas Jack had been written and released in 1951. It's a book called Buckskin and Satin by Herschel Logan. And I read it, and it was like Texas Jack fought in the Civil War. Texas Jack and Buffalo Bill started the Wild West thing. Texas Jack probably did some other stuff, and then he died. And look, I have access to the internet, archived newspapers. Herschel Logan had access to wherever he could go and find something in a physical location. So as I tried to fill in the blanks in his book so I would have enough information to write something, I realized, well, that's the story, that somebody ought to write a biography of Texas Jack. And then at some point, it didn't hit me immediately, but eventually I realized this is the first cowboy to ever achieve any prominence at all. And if you look at what we think of cowboys in fiction, in movies, all of our westerns, they're not historically accurate. Cowboys didn't fight Indians. They didn't lead adventurous lives. If you move a cattle fast, it loses weight. which is the absolute last thing you want when you sell it by the pound. Cowboys paid for safe travel across Indian Territory. They paid per head of cattle. As soon as you got to Red River, you paid a fee so you could move across safely. They did not lead adventurous lives. But because Texas Jack, after he was a cowboy, became a government scout and did fight Indians and saved Buffalo Bill's life from Minneconjou and did, shoot weather vanes from Thomas Edison's hotel room and, did rescue trapped tourists in Yellowstone and all this stuff, that those stories kind of became amalgamated into his persona as a cowboy that he was already going to be anyway. Mm-hmm. Like when he went on stage, he was wearing his cavalry boots, he was wearing his Stetson hat. That was what we started to think a cowboy was supposed to look like. It's not based on cowboys, it's based on Texas Jack. Mm-hmm. Because Buffalo Bill made sure, after Texas Jack died, that his persona as the cowboy would be the thing that helped Buffalo Bill in the Wild West shows. Mm-hmm. He was basically telling the world, hey, it's me and my best friend, and this is our adventures. Only instead of saying it's Texas Jack, he said it's every cowboy. Mm-hmm. That's what they all should be like. And because Buffalo Bill said it, we just believed it. And so, yeah, and it turns out, I found out later that the book I had thought about writing, the book in 3 parts, 1 part about each, had already been written by an author named Johnny Boggs, who's the most awarded Western writer of all time. And I told him that. I said, I wouldn't have written this biography if you hadn't already written the book I wanted to write. And he laughed at me and he said, well, thank God I wrote it because this is a great biography, which was very nice of Johnny to say. He's a good guy. But yeah, so I kind of, God, a cowboy marrying a ballerina, like, why has Hollywood never made that movie?
Right. I guess they're ready for your screenplay in 3 years.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I've got to figure out how to, I've put some bait out, so we'll see. But yeah, it was just too good a story to not be told by somebody. And then I figured I was already there. So.
What I like is the trio, they weren't actors playing cowboys.
Right.
They were cowboys playing actors.
Yeah, and they were very bad actors. They were, in fact, when they first got to Chicago, which is where their first show was, they get to Chicago, and Buffalo Bill and Texas Jack have kind of been persuaded by a dime novelist named Ned Buntline that I've written this play for you, it's going to be great. You're going to get here, all you've got to do is go on stage and act like yourselves, and there's nothing to it. And so they got there, and 3 days before they were supposed to have their first show, and Ned Buntline met him at the train station and said, oh, let's go meet the theater owner. He takes him over to meet the theater owner. The theater owner says, well, you want to practice now? There's only 3 days. And Ned Buntline says, yeah, I got to go write the play first. And that was the first anybody realized that this was a complete seat-of-the-pants operation. So they go back to the hotel, and Buffalo Bill and Texas Jack drink heavily while nervously asking each other, is this something we can do? And Ned Buntline writes down a kind of play in about 4 hours. Well, so after the first show, a Chicago newspaper wrote, if Ned Buntline wrote this play in 4 hours, what in the hell was he doing that whole time? Pretty much everybody agreed there was not a plot. The plot was, in fact, the first show, it was supposed to be, Ned basically figured he could guide the action. He could kind of steer it if he was a character in the play himself. So he wrote a plot for himself, and his plan is, anytime they don't know what's doing, I'll just go, hey, isn't it time to look for the whatever? Well, so the show's supposed to start. Ned Buntline walks out, and there's a big forest backdrop behind him on stage, and he says, there's danger around every corner. There's mountain lions, there's savages, there's renegades, there's all kinds of things out there. And I'd definitely die if it wasn't for the fact that the 2 greatest men in all of Western history are coming soon. Well, and he was supposed to bang his rifle on the stage floor so that they'd know when to come out. But right before he could, a drunk guy from the audience walked down and jumped on stage. And he held out a bottle of whiskey for Ned Buntline. Well, Ned Buntline was 2 things. He was a notorious drunk, and he was a temperance lecturer. So he took that opportunity to push the guy off the stage, where he landed. He actually crushed into a orchestra member's viola, I think. And while all that was happening, a cop comes down to drag the guy out, and Ned Buntline tells everybody in the audience about the dangers of firewater and how it's corrupted the savages and how they were great until the white men gave them the evil alcohol, and you shouldn't drink, any of you, and all this. And as he's saying this, you know, Buffalo Bill and Texas Jack are waiting back there for their cue to come on. Well, finally he gets done with his temperance lecture and bangs his thing, and they walk out there, and they kind of both stand there realizing, shit, we both forgot our lines. And so Ned Buntline says, hey, where y'all been? And they just stand there staring at the audience. And he says, Buffalo Bill, have you been on a buffalo hunt? And Buffalo Bill looks at him. He says, have you been hunting buffalo? He's trying to get him to say something. And Buffalo Bill looks out in the audience and realizes there's a guy out there named William Milligan, who'd been hunting with him the previous summer. And so he says, yeah, I was hunting with Milligan. And then he tells the real story of Milligan. Milligan was so Chicago had just gone through the Chicago fire. Milligan was the town's largest paint merchant. So after the fire, he made tons of money, and he spent some of it to go on a big Wild West hunt with Buffalo Bill and Texas Jack. Well, when he got out there, he kept telling them, I want to go and fight a Sioux. When I get here, if I see any of them, I'm going to go after them. And so they got out there to hunt buffalo, and Texas Jack said, I think that's a party of Sioux on that hill over there. And Milligan said, I got to go back to town. I forgot something. And so everybody in Chicago had kind of heard this story. So as soon as Buffalo Bill said, I was hunting with Milligan, everybody started laughing. And so he realized, well, he could tell that story and it would soothe things over. So that, of course, the next day they said, we can't just have a show where none of us know what's happening. And so the theater owner said, well, Texas Jack, when you go out on the stage, this time, instead of y'all just standing there waiting nervously, go and greet Buffalo Bill like you haven't seen him in a while. And so sure enough, the next night, Ned Buntline goes out and tells his, there's danger everywhere, my guys are whatever. And he bangs the thing and they walk out. Well, as soon as they walk out, Texas Jack goes, Jesus Christ, Bill, I haven't seen you in forever. How the hell are you? And the audience laughs because you're not supposed to curse or take the Lord's name in vain. And Buffalo Bill says, Jesus Christ, Jack, we're on stage in front of an audience. You can't talk like that. What have you been doing? And then Texas Jack tells a story, and that's how it starts. It really never got much better. In fact, a year later when they finally, they decided Ned Buntline had been making too much money, and they wanted, both Buffalo Bill and Texas Jack spent money like it was never going to end. Buffalo Bill his entire life. A lot of people say he's only buried in Denver because they were so broke that his wife was convinced by Harry Tamman, who owned the Denver Post, that he would pay off the debts that they owed if she'd just let him bury Buffalo Bill there. I don't know if that's true. She denied it, but that's one present rumor. Well, when they got to their next tour, they convinced Wild Bill Hickok to join them in the place of Ned Buntline. And so, same thing, their plan is we're going to start the show, we're all three going to go out on stage, and how we're going to start the show is there's going to be a fake campfire, and we'll all stand there looking at the audience with a campfire in between us. And Buffalo Bill will have a jug, and he'll take a sip, and he'll tell a story about a buffalo hunt. And then he'll pass that jug to Texas Jack. He'll take a sip and he'll tell a story about a cattle stampede. And then he'll pass it to Wild Bill and he'll take a sip and he'll tell a story about being a sheriff in Kansas. Well, it works out all right. Buffalo Bill tells his story, passes the jug. Texas Jack tells a story and passes the jug. And Wild Bill takes a sip. He spits it out all over the stage. And he says, damn it, boys, if you don't think I know the difference between whiskey and cold tea, you must think I'm the biggest fool west of the Rockies. He says, if I don't get real whiskey, I can't tell a story under temptation. And so as the audience laughs, somebody has to run next door and get real whiskey so Wild Bill can tell a real story. They never really became very good actors. But what they eventually realized is that no one was coming to see actors. They were coming to see Western heroes. They wanted reality. In a lot of ways, they were the first reality stars. They were ahead of their time. Eventually, even though they could act, it turned out no one wanted them to. They wanted them to act like they expected them to, which was don't act like an actor, act like a cowboy, act like a scout, act like Texas Jack. That's what they wanted. That was a very long answer to whatever the question.
There's a good one though.
Any other questions at all? Western history?
Do you know if Texas Jack went on the Goodnight Loving
He
trail
did
through Colorado?
lead cattle on it because there's an interview that he did with the Spirit of the Times magazine where he talks about some of the places he's seen. So I know for a fact he at one point did the California Trail and saw Yosemite because he talks about it. He talks about doing the Goodnight Loving, the Chisholm. He did quite a bit. He kind of did all of that over the span of what amounted to 3.5 to 4 years. He actually set out to be a cowboy immediately after the Civil War. He went down to New Orleans to catch a boat over to Galveston, but the boat, there was a storm and the boat capsized and they were shipwrecked on the coast of Florida, and they said, we can get another boat, and he said, hell no. He became a school teacher for a year in the panhandle of Florida. He told a story about that when he got there and he became a school teacher, the first day that he taught his students, after they'd all gone home, an irate father came rushing into the schoolhouse, upset with Texas Jack because he said, you're lying to my children. You told them that the sun sits still and the earth goes around it. When everybody can see, the sun comes up and it goes down. You're lying to the kids. It's dangerous. I won't have it. So when Texas Jack finally went through being a cowboy and then got to North Platte where he became a scout, first he became a bartender and then he taught school. And when they asked him, do you teach whether the world's flat or round? He said, I can teach it either way you want, I just need the money. I guess frontier teaching was probably no easier then than it is now.
I got a kick out of his letter to the school marm
Oh,
asking for
yeah.
the position.
Right. Yeah, so the school marm was apparently retiring. And so Texas Jack thought, well, the way to get the job is to write her a letter and just use the largest, most elaborate language I possibly can so that she'll know I'm educated. Well, apparently she didn't know what any of those words meant, and she took it as an insult. And so a group of the town people came to ask him why he'd been insulting the teacher if he wanted the job. And he had to explain, no, that's, erudition doesn't mean anything bad.